Hi, everybody, and thanks for attending today's webinar, DevSecOps Roundtable, the new frontier for automation. My name is Raisa, and I'm on the marketing team at Progress. Before I turn it over to our speaker, I have a couple of housekeeping items to cover. If you have any questions, you can submit them in the Q&A section at any time, and they will be answered during or at the end of the presentation. For the best reading experience, we recommend closing any additional programs or browser sessions running in the background, as webinars are bandwidth intensive. And finally, as always, this webinar is being recorded and an on-demand version of the presentation will be available to you in a couple of days. So let's go ahead and get started. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Raisa. Hello, everyone. My name is Alan Baptista. I'm the product marketing manager for our Chef compliance solution here at Chef Software, now a part of Progress. I have the distinguished honor of routing some interesting cats here. AJ, Chris Hughes, and Chris Medina have been gracious enough to be part of this roundtable. This is actually a second edition of our conversation around DevSecOps. So I'm going to let each one kind of introduce themselves, and then we'll get back to some topics of discussion all around DevSecOps and the impact of automation in that arena. If you have questions or would like to pose a question that I need to moderate, please post them on the Q&A tab in your browser. First of all, AJ, why don't you start off talking and tell us about your background and who you are, and tell me about, what else is on your mind.
Thanks a lot, Alan. Pleasure to be here today with you and the two Chris's down there that we got here joining us. It's always good to talk with you about these topics. I'm AJ Yawn. I am the co-founder and CEO at ByteChek. Also participate on a few boards, the National Association of Black Compliance and Risk Management Professionals, ISO Spread Miami. I started my cybersecurity career in the U.S. Army, where I served for 6 years as a signal officer, ended up leaving the service after earning the rank of captain, and went to work in cybersecurity compliance consulting for a few years, where I helped an organization grow and specialize in SOC 2, ISO, HIPAA, high trust. And through that all, I realized that compliance sucked, and I started ByteChek with my good friend Jeff Cook to make compliance suck less. We built a cybersecurity software solution to automate the compliance process. So really excited to talk about DevSecOps today. I think it's critical from a compliance perspective and just security perspective overall. So excited for this conversation with some really smart people in the industry. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, I love your tagline. We'll make compliance suck less. That's awesome. Chris H., why don't you tell us a little bit about you and what's on your mind?
Definitely. So, been in the cybersecurity career field for about 15 years almost. Got my start in the military as well, except for in the Air Force, not the Army, gratefully, like AJ. I started off in the Air Force in cybersecurity, and then from there, worked in the industry for a bit of time, and was a Navy civilian as well, focused on cybersecurity and cloud security. And I also worked for GSA, General Services Administration, where I was part of the FedRAMP Joint Authorization Board, looking at cloud service offerings for the federal government, essentially. Outside of those roles, I'm back on the industry side of things now, doing DevSecOps within the public sector, in particular DoD with the Air Force and the Space Force and some other organizations. And I also teach at a couple of universities, University of Maryland Global Campus and Capital Technology University in their graduate cybersecurity programs, and just passionate about cloud security, DevSecOps, and all things included in those areas.
Very cool. So we have Army, Air Force, and I couldn't forget the Navy, right?
Please don't forget the Navy. I mean, all day
It's
long.
dawned on me that we have all three forces here.
Very well represented, and I like it. We have to get a Marine Corps person in here and see what we can do. We can stir the pot. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Medina. I've been doing this for quite a while. Back in '92 is when I started with the U.S. Navy, and I've worked for actually three-letter agencies, 4 altogether, if you count some overlap service. But I've done everything from Homeland Security and IT direction for UCS, UC, storage with EMC, Cisco routing. I've been kind of around the block a little ways, but super excited to be here today with these two, especially from adjoining branches. Air Force, definitely love those guys all day. They didn't have it back in my day, but I can't remember the other group. Oh yeah, Army. They've always been real good. Got to take a poke at AJ. I poked at him last time, but excited to be with these two professionals here today, and looking forward to the conversation.
Very cool. Thank you. So let's start. DevSecOps. What does it really mean?
Who wants to take
Anybody?
a stab at it first?
Who wants first dibs?
So I'll jump in and basically say, it has many interpretations or definitions depending on who you ask, but essentially it's kind of tearing down the silos between the development team and the operations team, and then ultimately security came into play too to make DevSecOps, tearing down those silos and moving away from just kind of throwing things over the fence from development perspective to operations, or operations focusing entirely on stability and not wanting to interject any kind of changes or something that can cause interruptions. And then of course security, trying to be integrated into the process versus bolted on at the end of development, and as it traditionally has been. So that's how I look at it, and it's leveraging a lot of lessons from other industries, even tracing back to manufacturing, for example, to make efficiency and improve the way we deliver software.
Yeah, and I think when you think about DevOps, when it originally was this became a thing before DevSecOps, it was all about speed. It was how do we integrate the CICD pipeline? How do we make it faster to go from idea to shipping? And DevSecOps, contrary to popular belief, it doesn't stop that. It doesn't stop the speed. It actually, and I think we'll get into this, is going to continue to allow you to move faster because you're considering security earlier. So you also always hear shift left, shift left. And I always laugh because it's like that's kind of infinite. You just keep shifting left until there's no more left, I guess, and you end up in a circle. But it's just like it's doing security things earlier. And I think the biggest thing that I've learned about DevSecOps over the years is it's not about technology. And while technology definitely helps and is going to help you do it a lot faster and easier, but it's about a philosophy. It's about a mindset shift. To really, everyone thinks about security, from the developers to the product managers to even the executives who are thinking about these ideas. They have security in mind at every single step of the process, and that's the organizations I see the most successful. They obviously have great tools to help them get through the DevSecOps process, but first they have the mindset where they actually care about security very early on in the process.
Yeah, it resonates. I think the people, processes, and technology that is a fundamental part of DevOps, I think also applies for this factor. We're just bringing in another element of responsibility and trying to shift everything left. And yeah, we are going to talk about the impacts that we've seen in our customer bases. Chris Medina, any thoughts on DevSecOps and how does it play a role in what you do?
So yeah, I would track on what AJ said there for a second. I think it revolves really around the speed, right? When we were doing this back in the day, it was all really just scripting, some of the mundane things and trying to get things out to production a little bit quicker. And then what we found as we started to increase all the automation, we started using cron jobs and allowing things to move through a process, that security often ended up slowing us down big time. And so, building security into the plan, I think over the evolution, right? This is kind of the maturity of where we've gone with DevOps, has shown that we can actually increase the speed to production with everything that we're developing, and at such a fast rate. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we talk about how speed, I guess, is one of the benefits we see out of a DevSecOps kind of practice. Are there any other elements that you think come to mind? Here's a good question, by the way. Let me kind of switch real quick. The inner circle on this image is really the CI/CD delivery pipeline, right? Of that continuum in DevOps. and this was question I was going to ask later on, but the question this gentleman has is, can you truly incorporate DevSecOps practices without leveraging a CI/CD pipeline practice?
I think it's tough. Chris, both Chris, we were all in the military, and we all learned to do land navigation with the compass and the map. But it's a lot easier to do it with the GPS tool, right? So I think you could, I guess, you could do DevSecOps without leveraging the CI/CD pipeline. You're gonna have some work cut out for you. There's gonna be a lot of activities that you're gonna have to do, a lot of monitoring that you may run into, but I think in order to do it right, you have to incorporate it into the CI/CD pipeline. You have to have automation. You have to leverage tools and technologies to catch things earlier, so that you have these areas where a developer, even in their IDE environment, at the real beginning, they can know if there's a security weakness that early. And you, without tools, it's going to be tough. And without embedding into the CI/CD pipeline, it's going to be tough, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. Part of the pursuit of DevOps and DevSecOps is shortening feedback loops, right? So without having these pipelines in place and getting that quick iterative feedback to developers as they're producing code, or even folks producing infrastructure as code, which I'm sure we'll touch on too, and without having those pipelines and tooling in place, it's going to be very difficult to maximize the efficiencies and take advantage of those aspects in terms of DevSecOps.
Well, let me ask you guys a question though, because in my mind, I'm just a little confused, because in my mind, I see it as a framework, right? This is a workflow. CI/CD is really a part of that whole framework. They're one and the same. So, I mean, literally I meet customers who are, still using shell scripts to do parts of their automation. And it's a true workflow. I mean, they have some elaborate things that are out there that work for them, very painfully, I would say. I think, there's obviously, when we talk about levels of maturity in that workflow, though, CI/CD is a part of it. And so no matter what you call it, you're going to be able to do something that integrates, and you're going to want to integrate certain configurations, or how Gardner calls it, specifications, into the release into production, so that you're more secure, and that you maintain, especially around SLA plans, proper availability. Thoughts on that?
I think you're touching on some things there, and most of which is that there's no one way to do DevOps or DevSecOps, right? It depends on your organization, your culture, your resources, your skill sets. It ultimately depends on what works for your organization. There's no one way to do it. And I also will say, it can go the other direction. We talked about tooling and how important tooling is. Sometimes people get fixated on tooling, from an organizational perspective. And they keep, adding more tools to the mix, and you get tool sprawl. Half the tools aren't even fully implemented, fully configured. No one's really monitoring or using them or maximizing them. They haven't really been tuned for the environment. You don't have baselines established. So you can definitely go too far in one direction too, in terms of technology and tooling, and not focusing on processes and people as well.
Yeah, that tool sprawl is real. It's so real. You can get to a point where you have all these things and they don't even talk to each other. You have tools you're paying tens of thousands of dollars for that nobody even has an account on, and it gets kind of wild when you start chasing tools instead of understanding processes and philosophy of the organization.
Very true. Yeah, and the people involved for sure, because security now is becoming, like you mentioned, AJ, the responsibility of everyone in the organization. It's not just because it could come through in a simple email, right? If you're phishing and finance hits it and it sprawls from there. So it really is every hands on deck, pun intended there. So there's an interesting question here. DevOps will evolve for sure. Is DevSecOps the next station, or are we already there? How do you see adoption of DevSecOps, or at least the terminology or the intent or the desire the organizations have to incorporate security into that automation, into that aspect of expedience of the pipeline of CICD is proposing to do for development and for delivery?
Yeah, it was a good question from, I think it was Alan. I tried to respond in the chat there. Is honestly, I think it depends on the industry and the organization. Everyone's a little bit further along on their journey, or at different places, I should say, on their journey and their maturation towards DevSecOps, for example. I can speak for the public sector and DoD. DevSecOps is definitely the definitive term that's being pursued among various programs, beyond just DevOps. But there are some purists, I guess you could say, who would argue that quality is just a function of of basically DevOps, right? So quality, they argue quality is security. So some people don't like the term DevSecOps. I've also heard SecDevOps. Which I'm not personally a big fan of, just for the reason that, unless you're a security vendor, I think we're not in the business of security. Like, ultimately security can help enable the business and empower the business, but security is not the business. So I think that, DevSecOps is a fitting term. And just to answer his question, I think it truly depends on the organization and where they are on that journey. Some may have not interjected security into the process yet and be more of a DevOps, implementation versus DevSecOps, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think
Totally
for what I've seen is that about a few years ago, if you heard DevSecOps at a startup or at an enterprise level organization, like, oh wow, they're really advanced, they're really mature from a security perspective because they have DevSecOps principles in place. And I think now when you hear it, you're just like, okay, that's expected. You should be doing some kind of something as it relates to DevSecOps, or at least be talking about it. And I think that's kind of what I've seen as the adoption goes. So to answer the question, as far as the next station, I think we are there. I think we're at a point now where it's expected a security professional shows up, they're going to ask about the CICD pipeline. And maybe we weren't there a few years ago, but I think that's where we're at now, which is good. Now, when it comes to maturity, I'm with Chris. You have varying levels. Even if everybody's talking about it, there may not have been any movement on actually doing things, or especially at the startup stage. It's really hard to get a startup to focus on security. When your one responsibility is to ship new code as fast as possible and get these features out for your customers. So it's difficult at that stage from a maturity perspective, but I think the mentality, especially just from the engineer side, you're starting to hear more of it from their side. They understand that they have to do more things from a security perspective earlier. And you can see it with some of even just the job openings that are out there and some of the things that are popping up in those, where you're starting to get asked questions about tools like Inspect, and if you have experience with those. So I think we're there, which is a good sign for the industry for sure.
very valid point. There's one thing that we talked about, the benefits of Chef or of DevSecOps, and there's an interesting. This is kind of our positioning as well in terms of the balance between. We talked about speed, but security. Typically, organizations have to decide, right? You can't have them both at the same time. Typically, perceived at least, that you can't have them both. Do you agree that there's this constant balance between, or weight between speed? I can get speed, but then I sacrifice security, or vice versa. How do you see that balance happening?
I just don't think it's a balance. I think that if you think about security as a blocker, it's probably because you haven't implemented DevSecOps principles and you're catching it at the end. But if you do it early enough, you're actually gonna be able to move faster because there's not gonna be rework, which security rework doesn't just mean like rewrite a line of code, it's re-architecture. You gotta go back and do everything over. And you have to really spend a lot of man hours to restart things. So I think this mentality, I think it's because of where we came, right? We started with DevOps, which was all about speed, all about getting things out fast. And then security became the blocker. Security was the blocker at the end. It was stopping things from getting out to customers. So then it became this speed versus security thing. And I think when we peel it back and we really look at it, doing security earlier will actually allow you to move faster because you don't have to rework. You don't have to go back and redo things because you caught issues earlier. So I think when you think about DevSecOps, it's definitely a way that you can take away the scale and you can see it as security actually enhances. It makes you go faster. You're not sacrificing one for the other. It's a booster, kind of like what Chris was saying, like you're not in the business of security. Security is not in the business of slowing you down. It actually will speed you up if you do it right.
And so I will, I guess, play devil's advocate a little bit and say that, ultimately you could just focus strictly on speed, right? We're not going to consider security at all, but there's going to be long-term trail ramifications to accompany that to the organization, so there is going to be some natural sense of tension, right, between the two teams and the organizations. But that's why it's important to integrate the teams and work together and break down those silos, and also bring the security tooling integrate with the developer workflow, so it's more seamless, it's less friction based for them, and it's more natural for the way they operate. This eliminates some of that friction, and it kind of eliminates some of that tension between the teams, so they don't see security as always being a blocker or someone trying to slow them down, and it integrates more with what they're used to doing, their way of doing things, and it's more natural.
Yeah, we
Any
used to
thoughts
say
there,
back
Medina?
in yeah, we used to say back in the day, speed, security, price, pick two, right? And from my perspective, a lot with what AJ is saying, I think AJ is probably the next generation of it all, because the integration of security at the time of development. Look, development wants to go fast always, right? Get it out there as fast as you can. Operations wants nothing changed. Do not mess with what I've created and how my process flow works. It's all working well, and I can maintain, we had a comment on SREs out there. They can maintain the level of assurance with production feature functionality and new infrastructure. But then security has always been, or had the mentality of stop, right? Right there. Let's check you out. Let's investigate everything and make sure. Well, the reality is now on a 0 day, we've got to be able to respond as fast as we can. Today, we've found that integrating security early on in the process has really sped production availability much faster than what we had when we had direct connections and we were just mainly doing base configurations on the fly, especially at times of 0 day. So, we're seeing these scales, to Chris Hughes's point, is going to, they really are going to go away. It can't be, it can't be, a true balance. It's all going to be there for everybody to be able to agilely deploy and make available.
And there's a lot of innovations we can take advantage to make this less painful too, like infrastructure as code, compliance as code, cloud environments, hardened containers. All these things can streamline that process and kind of bake security in from the beginning. That way it is not a bolted on activity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I guess we'll get to the point here, but the point is that we believe that only through automation are you able to really have the cake and eat it too. But so I guess I'm spoiling it for the end. But here's an interesting question that just came up. When people consider DevSecOps an SRE, as an SRE, we try to automate what's manual, interpret monitoring, and have it make sense for the processes and workflows involved and reduce the toll. He can definitely relate to a lot of the conversation in terms of speed, especially if there's an incident involved that demands immediate resolution in the product environment. I guess there wasn't a question there, more of a validation of the point that we're trying to make here. One thing that we see in some of our research that we did with IDC and IDG was the question we posed was, does DevSecOps impact the pace of software delivery? And if you look here, the oranges are adopters of DevSecOps practices, and the black is non-adopters. Well, the adopters agreed by 47%, stating that it does speed up the delivery, while the non-adopters thinks that it slows them down. So it's an interesting dichotomy there that it's counterintuitive in many ways, that adopting DevSecOps practices actually speeds up delivery, to validate AJ's earlier point. And then the other one we had was, what are the benefits of integrating DevSecOps practices into software development lifecycle? The improved efficiency of audits, reduced risks of breach, greater agility, a faster product rollout, increased innovation, and cost savings is the last part. So any form of agility, speed, and security are involved in that, and it seems quite of an interesting aspect of that. How do you see DevSecOps impacting different parts of the organization? I guess compliance in your case, AJ, how do you see that impacting a compliance officer or a compliance team?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the true audit answer, right? It depends, but it depends on the compliance manager, the audit professional. The more that they understand about DevSecOps, the easier the audit becomes. And the biggest benefit that I've seen for an organization that really truly embraces the DevSecOps mentality and technology is there's no black box no more. They don't have their auditor show up and find thousands of issues that they had no clue were happening, because throughout the year, they know when things are falling off and out of compliance. And that's usually what happens, especially at these large organizations. You'll be hard pressed to do a thorough and good audit and not find an issue, because there's so many resources, they're constantly changing. But when you see that someone has a DevSecOps tool, or not just a tool, but just a whole process, you rarely find any issues that actually make it to a production environment from an infrastructure standpoint or from a software development perspective. So I think from an audit and compliance perspective, it eliminates that. I wonder how our audit's going to do. Like, if you have a DevSecOps mentality, you know exactly how your audit's going to go, because you know when things are falling off throughout the year. And I think it also helps reduce the hardest part about the audit, which is evidence collection. Less screenshots. That's the part that sucks about compliance. It's taking all those screenshots, all those print to PDFs. You don't have to do that anymore. When you have tools in place that are capturing things earlier, automatically testing things, automatically kicking things back, a lot of that nonsense that goes into the audit goes away. That's some of the benefits I see from the compliance side.
Cool. Hughes, you have a story or an analogy that you talk about in terms of audits. How do you see audits? And you're the receiving end in many ways, or you're kicking it off, and you have a play as a security professional. How do you see audits?
Yeah, I have 3 young kids, soon to be 4 in about 2 weeks here, and I always think of it like, coming to check if their room is clean, right? Like when they know I'm coming, they're scrambling, everything's getting together, everything's getting picked up real quick, and maybe not put in the right place, but it's getting picked up real quick, and then I check on it, and everything looks good, but then I walk away and things start to fall apart again. You get to, for keeping with our topic, you get compliance deviation, right? Things are falling out of compliance, and not adhering with requirements, right? And typically, when I've worked in the DoD or public sector government space, for example, audits and assessments occur on like a 3-year period or an annual period, for example, and that's no way to get true visibility in terms of, compliance or security posture, for example. It may be in place at that point snapshot in time, but it doesn't mean you're in a compliant state, at most of the time. Basically, you're just, a mad dash, get everything together. Whew, we passed the audit. Okay, we don't have to worry about that again for 12 or 36 months. But guess what? The adversaries, for example, they're worrying about that every second. They don't care whether you're good for a moment in time. They want to look all the time.
Chris Hughes, or Chris Medina now. Talk to me about the periodicity or the kind of, this slide is part of our positioning, and how do you see audits playing in this area?
Well, I mean, just like that analogy, which was fantastic. I'm thinking about Chris's analogy too, and I'm thinking, what does that make DevSecOps the clean as you go methodology, right? How do we make sure that when Dad walks up the stairs and pops open the door,
It's
that
the closet where you just smash everything in, shut the door.
That's exactly right. So, I mean, how he described it, your chart there on the left is, those audit points in time where, everybody's rushed to make sure everything is aligned, that all the holes are sealed up, there's no gaps, and everything looks great, until the next time that you do that. You're looking at an assumed compliance level, where in actuality, on the right side, we've messed up the room, we've used the toys, we've wanted to introduce, especially with DevOps, right? We've been introducing new feature functionality, new infrastructure, neat ways to beat the market, right, or beat our competition to market, and those things need to be inspected. Those things need to be aligned. And if we didn't do it along the way, you're just going to rush into, the next audit time frame where you've got it all compliant. So you never truly have a full visibility. And so that's the story for these couple of charts in my mind.
I think this is the greatest slide that describes compliance ever. It's like one of my favorite slides I've ever seen in the compliance industry, because it is just so accurate. It's ridiculously accurate. Like every single, if you're going through an audit, if you're watching this, grab a screenshot and then just ask your auditor to explain this during the conversations with your auditor, and just see what happens. And you'll find out if you have a good auditor or not, depending on what they agree with here. But this is just an amazing slide. So kudos to you all for putting this together.
And one point that you made, AJ, that I want to kind of reinforce here, and the reality is that audits are a subset of the complete population of your environments. And when you look at cloud instances and proliferating resources and just the sprawl of everything and the instant, 0+1, everything changes and you're non-compliant thereafter. So how do you get that solved? How do you get, how do you resolve that? And we believe that it's only through automation. How do you see that automation playing a role here?
To AJ, I did want to jump in. I actually just gave an RSA conference presentation, and I think it's definitely, like you said, automation and cloud environments, APIs, and on-demand assessment. For example, sticking with the bedroom analogy, if I come in and do a sample of I'm going to check 3 things. That's not really a full scope picture of how cleanly the room is, for example, right? We need to have full visibility of the entire environment, and cloud enabled architectures, for example, and automation. Those give you that, something you can't get with legacy approaches. And I'll kick it back to AJ. Yeah,
I'm with you, Alan. I think you have to use automation. I just don't think I'm not going to say you can't, because I'm not going to tell anyone they can't do anything. People can do stuff. They probably can figure this out, right? But it's very difficult to do it in a correct and comprehensive manner without automation. I think that's going to be key and critical to success when it comes to actually figuring out actual compliance levels, as the slide says, because the periodic audits are not telling the story. I hope that we have a framework that can actually do this here and actually test continuous automation and continuous compliance levels. I don't think we're there yet. So until we're there, security professionals should not kind of assume that a compliance report reflects true status of their environment, because it's just not going to tell you the truth. So use compliance for what it should be used for, to drive sales, to have a third party come in and evaluate what's going on. But when it comes to actually assessing compliance, and you want to actually understand, am I meeting this CIS benchmark, or am I meeting this random regulation that just pops up? Every few years we get a new one. Am I meeting this random standard? You need automation to do that. You need automation to do that on a regular basis, continuous basis, in my opinion now.
Yeah, I agree. There's comment here in the chat. Compliance reports only gives us reasonable assurance, and we talk, and I think that's true. We also talk a lot about continuous compliance and how only through automation, right, Chris Medina, how through automation you're able to have that continuous compliance state, because you're reducing the amount of time between the checks. You're doing it consistently and automatically, really. Yeah. Thoughts there, Chris?
Absolutely. So there's a couple things I think about automation. Number one is that there are an incredible amount of individuals out there who are deathly afraid of automation. Why? I haven't truly figured out how to integrate it into some type of controlled workflow. In other words, hey, how do I get automation to work and not let it go, not let it create changes that will break? How do I know it's not going to break something that I've introduced or that I'm wanting to introduce? So there's some inhibitions about putting automation in practice that way. Let me assure you that there's plenty of ways to do this. Folks over at ByteChek, very good at, integrations and understanding how to put that stuff together. Obviously we do here at Chef. I don't know about Rise 8 that much, Chris. I'm sure they've got some story around it, but the other part to automation is that it can be a huge benefit in terms of maintaining compliance, in such that if you're using automation to make the changes and not actual humans, then you can rest assured, as an ops guy, I spent countless hours chasing people, trying to understand, why they were on the server, getting their kids' basketball pictures off. It was completely like a wild goose chase. I can't tell you how many hours I spent doing that. Just people just randomly just looking around for things that was not worth my time at all. If I knew that only, the system was making the changes, then I could be, much more reasonably sure that any infiltration was probably some person who is up to no good, right? A bad guy, just some bad actor trying to do something that we weren't allowing. And so if you can get to that state, then you're going to save yourself an incredible amount of time and money on those people who are doing the research altogether up front. So automation is just something that everyone needs to embrace. And one thing around automation is I would tell you that incorporating test into that automated workflow, if you're testing against the dependencies of which you're making these changes, hey, I'm turning off port 21. Exactly what will that do to production if I do that? Let's test that as we do it. Automation becomes your friend all day long. So I highly encourage it.
Very good points. There's one slide that I also like a lot is the distinction that we talked about tool sprawls, I think, earlier on, and how just bringing tools for the tool's sake doesn't really make sense. And this is where we think that different teams have different tools, may have different languages that they're using as well. So compliance has a series of checklists and things that they need to validate it up against. Security is trying to lock down everything, and DevOps or operations is trying to implement in different tools, trying to implement some level of automation and unable to do that. Do you guys see this reality of different languages, different tools, different kind of a babble of everything, trying to mix and trying to solve a common solution with different tools or different views? How do you see that out there? Let's start with Medina.
Well, so this brings me back to one word, which is declarative and declarative language, right? It's got to be clean across the board, because otherwise you're hiring a gigantic staff of people to be able to maintain all this. And I think Chris Hughes said it earlier, where you start to get sprawl in tool sets. You start to get sprawl in configuration alignments and specifications for different parts of your enterprise, who need, certain things where others don't. It just gets mind blowing. And so to be able to automate those things really makes it easy. But, to do it all in one declarative style of language, something easy to read, something everybody can interpret, something that's right there. I work with a number of large auditors, some SIs who come in and work with the federal government, who really like the thought of that, right? They're able to apply those practices. They're able to show them and understand exactly what it is the particular agency or that company is doing in terms of their compliance and their mitigation, and give them a good report, right? If you can't, if you're going to do it all over the place, then you're going to feel the pain of time to really understand what it is that you have around you, and then B, the expense that you're going to have to pay and all the people you need to really get a decent report or analysis of where you are.
So my resident security and compliance personnel there, Hughes, how do you see security? Is this true? Is this scenario where you're using different tools than compliance buds are? And how do you see that?
Yeah, no, I think Chris Medina raises some great points, and it definitely has to be a declarative approach, and it has to be, this is why syntax is important and having standardized syntax. And, there's a multitude of benefits to it too. Like he talked about, obviously we see security, compliance, and DevOps on the screen, and we need those three to be able to, work together and integrate across their diverse tool sets that they're using and platforms they may be using. But he also brought up the point of assessors and auditors, for example. I think this is why having declarative and standardized syntax, for example, that's widely adopted, could be beneficial, not just internal to an organization, but external to an organization too, across an industry, for example, as they start to get, coalesce around a certain way of doing things. And it basically, the rising tide lifts all ships type approach. Everyone kind of benefits from coalescing around that versus just having these, endless amount of disparate solutions and approaches to doing things.
Yeah, I think this is why there's challenges with DevSecOps and compliance, is because of this problem of the different languages and tools. Compliance individuals need evidence in one manner, and the engineers now have to go waste time to go get it in that same manner that they need it, and instead of being able to do it in the tools that they're currently using. And I think one of our responsibilities as security professionals, as compliance professionals, is we got to go to them. I think I don't think it needs to be the other way around where they need to come to us. I think we need to go to where our engineers are, figure out what tools they're currently using, and how do we embed ourselves there and speak that same language. And it's similar in life. Communication is, will solve 90% of our problems. And I think the similar aspect here, where if you can get everyone just speaking the same language, reading the same information, and it's all in the same syntax, same format, all that good stuff, then you have this common use case, and be able to use this in a manner that everybody understands. It doesn't matter your experience, doesn't matter what your philosophy is. You can read, what's going on, and that's really I think the key step to it. But I think it is a challenge. That slide is a really good depiction of the challenges with those different silos.
I think the bigger challenge though is getting them to agree, right? The bigger challenge is, as a compliance person, I don't necessarily need what development needs, or I don't care about what development needs. As an ops person, I could care less about the tools that they're using and what it is that they're doing. I'm just trying to get stuff out to production. So the needs are different, and that's where the hard part comes in. I've gotten these folks in a room, on occasion when I can, and it literally can turn into a fist fight. I mean, people just yelling at each other across the room, and this is more important, or my priority is more important. And the reality is, to be able to bring it all together is truly when you start to move really fast.
Yeah, and to that point, this is where we believe that through code is the only way that you're able to leverage some level of automation, because code becomes a collaborative tool. It becomes ubiquitous common language, especially in our tool set. Obviously, we're a software vendor, so we're pushing our inspec. Thanks for the shirt, Chris, by the way. So that is the language that we're proposing in Ruby. It's human readable. It's very understandable by everybody involved. You have referencing the compliance profiles that everybody is trying to reach, and it's documented, and it becomes that single source of truth. And to be able to do a continuous compliance state, you're able to have something that is able to done very scalable and automatically done. So you're able to have that capability done consistently and comprehensively across your entire estate, be it a cloud instance, be it a data center, or on-prem. You're able to shift left, like we talked about, bringing that code understanding earlier in the process in a way that it is automated, it is consistent, and it provides that continuous visibility. We talked a lot about compliance as code in our previous session, so you're able to see, if you want more details on how we see compliance as code playing a role, you can see that in the recordings on our website. So how do you see code involved here, AJ, in compliance as code?
Yeah, I think this is where you can actually get a lot of the compliance activities done at the beginning of the process. As the slide says here, you're able to test throughout the software delivery process by using code, by not waiting for everything to be done, not waiting for engineers to spend hours and hours of time working on something only to say, hey, you got to go back and try again. You do not pass go. You do not get to deploy this. You get to find out earlier on, and then you also get to know, like, hey, like, if I do this, I'm not going to pass this X certification or X standard or framework. And that's where you can have some more automation in place. We're saying, like, just don't let them do that. If you don't want to deploy a certain type of EC2 instance, or as we're seeing here on the screen, if you don't want anyone to install a telnet server or have port 23 open, you can stop it here using code instead of waiting for an auditor to find out, which none of us want, or you to find out right before an audit, which again, that's the Chris's kids going and cleaning their room really quick before he comes in. It's the same thing, and this allows you to not do that. This allows you to keep that room clean throughout the process. And I think, as we talked about the same language, this allows compliance to not be a separate process. It allows compliance to be a part of just development in security as well, where it's just a part of what you do. You are going through and you're going to see these things. You're going to get alerts if you're doing something that's not going to be in accordance with your company's policies and procedures.
Cool. Anybody else thoughts on using
Yeah.
code here?
Yeah, I'll jump in. You know, as I mentioned, like most of my experiences in the public sector, we have mounds of policy documentation and compliance documentation that most people never go read, especially developers, you know, engineering type folks. They're not going to go read this stuff. They're not really familiar with it. And as a compliance professional or security professional, I can't really reasonably expect them to be familiar with our 17 different policies and our 378 controls we have to meet. You know, baking these into the compliance as code, you know, infrastructure as code type approach ensures that, you know, it can help give them that quick iterative feedback, whether it's at the IDE, you know, stage or as a part of a pipeline, if it gets kicked back saying, hey, you can't have this configuration in place, for example. And then not only that, you know, on the compliance front, but also on the security side, some of these configurations, for example, have real security ramifications. You know, if we allow these to get into a production operational environment, and then we come back and find it as part of an audit, what if I found it after an adversary has already found it and exploited it? That's a real problem. You know, so catching these earlier in the life cycle before they ever get put in production and can never be exploited by an adversary, that's the real win right there.
Yeah.
You know,
This has got to be the next station, right? Where Alan was talking about what's the next station. Think about it. You've got compute is a commodity, right? Storage, network, all commodities. We can get that anywhere. So understanding this, right? Being able to create the code that does the things, that aligns the things. If we can make it all as code, then we really are in that next phase of where we're going to be.
Yeah, we talk about through code, you're able to have this HumanFree Zone, which is, I guess, the nirvana of automation, if you want to take a look at it that way. But it's really what's been able to provide us this new DevSecOps security model. Chris, I think you do a kind of a story here. So you kind of walk us through what does this HumanFree Zone mean?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about this earlier. If you're implementing best practice around what a lot of people are catching on to in terms of zero trust, we do the multi-factor front ends, we're doing the session monitoring, and we're doing all the right things in the gateway, right? And we're doing our best. Let's just put it that way, right? Because that's where the 0 days happen. But on the backside, right, understanding what's happening. If I would say at least half of my customers are asking me, well, what about inside threat, right? What happens when something is asleep or something is gotten past the gates and is exploiting internally? How do I figure that out? Well, to implement zero trust methodologies, you can't have those direct lines into configuration. You can't have group logins and folks who are making changes to the system from kind of an open area. So from this particular picture, we've got automation doing all the things. And in fact, to some other folks were making comments about those who haven't embraced automation. Here is where we've put automation to the test and integrated in that human approval, where we've put gates in front of those particular sections of where we're doing specific things. We're integrating testing for the environment and understanding where the dependencies lack, but we're letting automation do all the work here. And so from a security perspective, I'm going, look, we make a change to a piece of code, whatever that is. If it's infrastructure, network, compute, like I said, even security, right? I can put my security policy in here as a piece of code and run it against the entire fleet, right? If I'm using good version control or good source code management, right, and allowing the pipeline to do those things through automation, then I know that when Chris Hughes goes looking for his kids' soccer pictures, we can understand that, he's not supposed to be in there, and we can go and reprimand him real quick. But if we see bad things happening east-west, understanding, even with patching, I think someone was asking about patching in here. If we've put if we're using the pipeline as the ATO mechanism or authorization to operate within production, we can certainly cut, hours and hours. Why does AJ Yawn's company have that logo? Let's make compliance suck less, right? There's hours upon hours. Anytime I got a report back from security, I was just shaking my head going, these are hours I can't spend looking for bad guys at the front door. Now I'm gonna have to go back and do some very mundane tasks, ensure that port 23 is open on this one and closed on that one, right? Ensure that I've got right configurations or nobody's created, group login permissions. These are mundane tasks for me that make me sleep all day. I don't want to do those things. So creating this zone where you're allowing automation to do those things for you has created an even more secure environment to where you can pinpoint your time to target. It's going to be so much quicker to be able to identify, any anomalies, all those things without having all those tool sets. And there's so many of them out there. So I'll let one of the guys beat me up on that one.
Yeah, no, I love what you're saying here. I mean, honestly, what you're describing, I don't really see it on the screen named specifically, but you talked earlier about the declarative approach, right? And leveraging infrastructure as code. So what Chris Medina is describing here is often referred to as the GitOps model. You have a declarative approach, you have an authoritative, source control repository basically, and everything gets committed into that. People aren't going in manually, you're not opening holes for people to come in externally and make changes, cause drift within your environment and make unauthorized changes. Everything is submitted through the GitOps model to a source code repository. It's checked against your security requirements as part of a pipeline before anything gets pushed to a production environment and any changes get made. So you have a lot tighter restriction and control around what changes are made, who made them, when they made them, and you can even revert back quicker to a more compliant, secure state if needed, if something did get through, for example. So he's removing, like as he says, a human-free zone. You're removing the human from the loop in that way, at least, in the production environment. You still have humans that may be part of a control gate, right, to review changes that are being proposed, but you're not having people going in there and just making changes on the fly.
And I think that's the key with compliance there is what both of you were talking about with infrastructure as code, is that's where you save a lot of time as well. We talked a lot about SDLC from a CICD pipeline perspective of software changes for your application. And that is a significant portion of compliance. Like you're gonna have to do a lot of evidence collection around that process. But if you're able to really do this right from an infrastructure standpoint, now you're really talking time savings in an assessment and in a compliance perspective, because that's numbers. I'm thinking off the top of my head, 10 to 15 different controls across different frameworks that you're going to be able to address doing infrastructure as code right. And I keep saying doing it right because I think everybody does a little bit of infrastructure as code nowadays to varying degrees of kind of what they're doing there. So if you're doing it the right way, you're going to reduce a lot of that work level of effort in an audit as well from a compliance perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on something he said, doing it the right way. I actually talked recently at a different event about this topic is, like infrastructure as code, for example, is very appealing because it's, it's auditable, it's version controlled. You can repeat it in many different environments very quickly, right? But if there's vulnerable configurations or misconfigurations in that, all you're doing is replicating those at scale very quickly. So there still needs to be rigor in place. Otherwise, you're just sprawling things, sprawling vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, and things like that, violations at a much more rapid pace.
Very cool. Closing thoughts on automation. Why does it matter?
Who wants to go first on that?
I'll give it a start, and I'll let the two Chris's come up with some better stuff behind me. And I just I get out of the way at the beginning. But I think it's impossible from a compliance perspective to do a thorough actual compliance assessment without automation. Resources change too fast. You can literally create a new server or new storage solution with a line of 4 words on an AWS CLI. It takes like literally 4 words to do that. So you imagine developers just doing that all day. It's very hard to say I know what's going on from a compliance perspective as just a human. So I think automation, if you're doing this right, and if you really want to know what's going on from a security perspective, you have to use automation, because guess what bad actors are? They're not doing things manually. They're using automation to break into your systems, and they're going to identify weaknesses if you're not able to identify them before them and then go out and remediate them. And that's where automation comes into play. Is reduces that time to response. From the time that you find something to the time that you're able to remediate it, that time shortens up, which is what you need to do in this world where bad actors have some pretty impressive tools to break into your systems.
Yeah, and I'll you know, come at it from another angle. Like I agree with him. It definitely reduces the window of exposure that someone can take advantage of a misconfiguration or a vulnerability, for example. And like as we move into these architectures, you know, we talked about the technical aspect of it. It's very complex, a lot of moving pieces, ephemeral, you know, entities, etc. But there's also a workforce component to this, right? You know, many people are not familiar with these environments. Not only that, but we don't necessarily have enough people to do all of this work all the time to be out manually assessing every single thing in your environment at all times. So from the workforce perspective, from a resourcing perspective, you know, automation is absolutely necessary.
I had some interesting conversations with the NIST folks in a panel that I was in about a year ago. Maybe it was 2 years ago now that I don't count the pandemic year. But you know, you think about quantum infiltrations. That's all automation, right? It's just the speed by which they do it. And automation can be, I think, is, you know, really the next station from. Think about it in terms of our typical operation when we fail is to roll back, right, to a known good state. With automation, if it's done properly with DevSecOps involved, we start to get the concept of rolling forward, right, where we can fix things on the fly, we can fix things as they move through, and then we can bring ourselves to that natural state. So automation is really where I think there's going to be some big investments within the next year with all the new algorithms and AI that's coming out. So just my
Very
closing
cool.
thought.
Yeah, I'm going to put here some slides on, if you want more on the compliance automation front, there's a Chef compliance page. The report on the stats that I showed are on the DevSecOps page. The Gartner compliance as code piece that was commissioned by Gartner, was done by Gartner, and if you want access to that report, you can find those links. As we have 3 more questions I want to address from the audience. I want to make sure we address, and one is kind of very pertinent here. If organizations that were recently affected by either the SolarWinds or the Colonial Pipeline breaches and many other recent breaches in the short term that we had known that we've seen and big impact in the overall organization, if they had taken this DevSecOps practice, either training or adoption of this level of automation, and had implemented SAST or DAST in their development pipelines, do you think that those breaches could have been avoided?
I think it's easy to armchair quarterback and say yes, but I would say, you know, it depends. You never know. They could have had all these DevSecOps principles in place, and maybe those folks did, and they just missed it. But I think DevSecOps helps you. It definitely would help. It would help potentially identify it, and maybe you would have caught something earlier. Now, is it a catch-all, be-all? No security professional will tell you that anything is going to prevent a security breach, because all of us can be breached or hacked at any moment. It's the nature of the business we're in. But I do think DevSecOps would have helped identify some stuff that is going on a lot earlier, and maybe you were able to do some additional activities to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, just to you know, kind of build on what he said, like, you know, it definitely may help identify something sooner, right, or respond to something sooner, for example. But there's a lot of other aspects at play from the security perspective. You may have an individual that has you know, administrative access or has access to sensitive data in the ransomware type case, for example, and they get phished, right? Like your DevOps, you know, DevSecOps pipeline in that case isn't really necessarily coming into play in that scenario. So there's security culture and awareness aspect to it. As we talked about culture in the beginning, that's part of it. And then on the SolarWinds piece, you know, we talked a lot about the pipeline and the role the pipeline plays in securing software and securing infrastructure as code. But there's also, you need to secure the pipeline itself, because the pipeline can basically be a conduit to go ahead and push out the poison, right? Either internal to your organization, or as we saw with SolarWinds, push it out to, you know, a broad third-party, you know, supplier. A consumption base. You're a supplier, right? And you push it out to many other organizations that now consume it from you. So you need to secure the pipeline as well as not just what's going through the pipeline.
Yeah, checksums are a very mundane and boring task, but they're very important, which could have prevented a lot from that aspect, right? Secure supply chain too, right? Understanding where you're getting things, making sure you have an authoritative, you know, piece or artifact that you're using, and then in putting that through automation is really kind of key there.
Cool. There's one question, and I think also through automation, you're able to remediate. You're maybe a lot faster as well. So I think there's an aspect of the remediation component that is also impactful there. Also mentioning, I'm trying to convince these experts to come back at Chef Conf, and maybe we'll have another panel discussion there. But if you're not, this is our user conference. Call for speakers is open. So if you're interested in submitting, it's open till June 30th. And these are the session tracks that we're going. chefconf.io is the website. It will be up later this week, and you can get more information there. In closing, I'm going to ask one last question, and also your final thoughts on DevSecOps and automation. So Vince asks, while DevSecOps saves time and money, in the long run, there's an upfront cost. How do you make the case to leadership or the board for the need to put hours and or open recs towards the security automation? Typically, their focus are revenue-based, so they don't really have budget and time in mind until it becomes an issue, and then backpedaling for that, such as losing a customer due to a security incident. So I think you sometimes, in my personal opinion, you have to slow down to move faster. But that's just the way I kind of summarize it. With that in mind, how do you implement DevSecOps from a leadership perspective? And your final thoughts on DevSecOps and automation, please.
So I'll jump on this one first, I guess, and then let the other two go. This is kind of the longstanding issue we have in security, right? Is getting leadership in some cases to invest the time and energy and effort, resources, et cetera, into security, especially if it can have an operational impact and slow down some other activities that are more closely aligned with the business, for example. They ultimately care about revenue, right? They're in the business of business, making profit, producing revenue. So what I would do in that case is point to other organizations that have adopted these DevSecOps practices and show the impact it's having on them in terms of how quickly they're bringing capabilities to market, how much more improved customer satisfaction they're having, things that the business can relate to and tie back to, actually making the business better. And I love what you said about sometimes you do have to slow down to speed up. If you're going very fast in the wrong direction, it's going to get you somewhere you don't want to go. So you do need to course correct and take that time to invest the time and resources into upskilling your workforce, right, to implement these practices.
I would use that analogy that Chris used on the kids' room, but this is the type of stuff that gets you from zero to hero, right? This implementing this stuff right up front and making investments up front can get you promoted. I mean, this is long-term gain. And if you do the analysis correctly, if you do short-term stuff, you're going to see, immediate results. We make, direct connections to production to change configurations. And we think, we went really fast, or we were able to respond quicker than anyone else, when in reality, we broke dependencies, we broke our SLA, so thinking about it long-term holistically is really something that you want to think about. It just kind of depends on where you're at that time.
Yeah, I think you can dive into the details and take management some stats and some numbers to show them the potential benefits. I've found success is when you bring a third party in to highlight a lot of weaknesses. So leverage ongoing activities that are going on in the organization and audit tools that exist, some open source stuff, whatever it may be. Leverage something to point out issues and say, hey, like if we don't fix these issues, here's the potential of things that can happen. And here's what I need to fix them. Because oftentimes I think to get security budget just requires you to be a seller. You have to be a salesman. You have to go in there and sell the problem and then sell the solution. And a lot of times that takes red numbers on all of us, the military background. We know if you put red dots on a slide, generals start moving. They start running and doing things. So just put some red dots on a slide and show them that there's bad things that are going on and what those bad things will result. And I think third parties help there, either third party tools or auditors or something to come in and say like, hey, these are the issues. Here's what you need to do to fix them. And then you're able to go take that internally to management and say, it's not just me. I'm not just the security person screaming that all of the sky's falling. Like other people also say that as well. And we need to fix this stuff.
Very cool. Again, thank you, gentlemen. I am humbled by your presence and your expertise in sharing all this greatness. I could go on for another half hour at least to chat about this, but it is lunchtime here in the Pacific Coast. So I need to go grab some food. But this session is being recorded and will be put into on demand. So those that are listening, if you want to share this with your colleagues, we will be sharing with you the link to the recording. If you want to catch another session, we didn't have Hughes then, but AJ and us, and we talked about compliance as code in depth and some more stats information. Hopefully this was great information. If you have more questions around our products, these are the pages that you need to visit and or reach out to us. We would, Chris Medina and I would be gladly walk you through specifics in our product and our functionality and how we want to see automation being adopted for a more DevSecOps world. Once again, thank you, everyone. I bid you farewell to the next time.
Go Navy.